So I'd like to welcome everybody from wherever you're tuning in to this discussion around our summer fiction issue of the Markaz Review, which is our double summer issue. And I'm going to be talking, I have the pleasure today to be talking to four translators who worked on translating pieces for our issue from Arabic to English. And, usually we, at the Markaz Review, we publish in four different languages, but like primarily we're usually working between Arabic and English. And so translators are a huge part of the work that we do. They are sort of the unsung heroes that bring pieces from across this diverse region, for people to be able to read them in English and to experience them in English. And I'm really, really happy as a translator myself to be able to lead this discussion today and to moderate this discussion with four of our translators because, the issue of translation is something that is more and more important, and the figure of the translator as well is someone who has become more and more important, or at least looking at how the translator and translation affects the final received text and the interactions that happen between different languages through the person of the translator. So we're going to be talking about all of these issues today, and I hope you enjoy it. So without further ado, I would like to begin by introducing our four interlocutors. Okay, so we have with us today Nada Faris, Zia Ahmed, Rossetti, and Rana Asfour. So Nada Faris is a writer and literary translator. In 2018, she received an Arab Woman Award from Harper's Bazaar Arabia for her impact on creatives in Kuwait. She's an honorary fellow at writing at Iowa University's International Writing Program, Fall 2013, and an alumna of the International Visitor Leadership Program 2018, empowering youth through the performing arts. Faris holds an MFA in creative writing from Columbia University. She's the author of multiple books in different genres. Her shorter works have appeared in the Norton Anthology for Hint Fiction, Gulf Coast Journal, Indianapolis Review, Nimrod, Tripes, Wanjakar, the American Journal of Poetry, and more. Lost in Mecca by Buthain al-Isa is Faris's first literary translation. So for this issue, she translated two pieces, actually, a story called Keeping Up by Muhammad Farag, as well as a story called Certainty by Noura Nagi. Zia Ahmed is an American writer and translator from Virginia. He lived in Muscat, Oman for 3 years. His work has appeared in the Washington Post, Asymptote Journal, Fard Adabi, and Nizwa, Oman's premier literary magazine. A translation of his Arabic short story, La Takhif, will appear in an upcoming issue of the Denver Quarterly. The story he translated for this issue is called A Blind Window on Childhood by Hamoud Saoud. Rossetti's published translations include the novel Beirut, Beirut by San'Allah Ibrahim, the short story collection Animals in Our Days by Muhammad Makhzangi, Utopia by Ahmed Khalid Tawfiq, and No Windmills in Basra by Zia Jubaili. His translations have also appeared in Asymptote, The White Review, Banipal, and Words Without Borders. He has a PhD in modern Arabic literature from the University of Pennsylvania and has worked in book publishing for over 20 years. He is currently the editorial director for the Library of Arabic Literature series published by New York University Press. For this issue, he translated The Doll with the Purple Scarf by Zia Jubaili, who he's worked with before. And finally, last but not least, we have Rana Asfour, who is both my friend and colleague at the Markaz Review. So she's the managing editor at the Markaz Review, and as well as a freelance writer, book critic, and translator. And her work has appeared in such publications as Madame Magazine, The Guardian UK, and The National UAE. She chairs the TMR English Language Book Group, which you should all tune into, and it meets online the last Sunday of every month. For this issue, she translated The Mulberry Tree by Muhammad al-Nas, but she also does a lot of translations for TMR and for many other publications. And in fact, you can check out her translation of Ahmed Naji's short story in Egypt Plus 100, which is a book that just appeared now from Common Press. So welcome, everybody. I hope everybody is doing well this evening. I'm very happy to have you here. I'm very happy to be starting this discussion with you about translation. I wanted to begin actually by asking each of you if you could just say a few words about about the story that you did end up translating for this issue and why you chose this piece. And what was it that drew you to this piece and the reason that you decided that you would like to translate it into English? So we can start actually with Neda and then move to Zia and Chip and then Rana. I think it might be easier that way, just the way that I read your bios.
So I translated 2 pieces, but I didn't pick them myself. One thing, maybe I can talk about this. You mentioned the figure of the translator, and the first book that I published was a work that I chose myself. But then the Markaz reached out to me to translate a previous story. And since then, like, I believe in the Markaz's vision. The team were absolutely amazing. So from that point, I was like, if you have anything you want me to translate, just send it my way. And like, they've never been wrong. The stories that they sent me were always stories that were eye-opening for me. They, like, the 2 stories that I translated for this particular piece, were very different in the details and the contents of the story. But I felt they were similar in the theme of what they were trying to analyze. For example, Muhammad Farag was exploring alienation in modernization, specifically through architecture. The way that modernization creates distance between people through the new buildings, through the technology that they're introducing. So alienation through modernization was a fascinating theme for me. Whereas Noura Nagi explores ghurba. So it's alienation in relationships, alienation in belonging and land. So these are the elements that drew me to the pieces, but the overall answer to that is, honestly, I was asking the Markaz Review, if you have anything, send it to me, because I already believe in you and your vision, and I know anything that you want to highlight is something that I stand behind.
I actually, I wanted to, the story that you translated by Noura Nagi is a really beautiful, I thought, it fits into this discussion very well, because I mean, it's also ultimately a story about language. It's an alienation from the land, but then it's somebody who is able to overcome alienation by learning a foreign language, and suddenly as the entire landscape transforms for her, and she's a young Egyptian woman, just for those who haven't read the story, in South Korea with her husband. And at first she's very alienated from her husband and feels, and I was really struck by the fact that she's walking through the city and she finds the smells abhorrent and she doesn't like the food. And then once she learns the language, she's discovering foods that she loves. The smell doesn't bother her anymore. She suddenly has friends. And it felt to me like such an interesting metaphor also for the idea of translation and the way that it can overcome this alienation of language and make us able to to find familiar in the unfamiliar, and to make home, because essentially what ends up happening is once she learns the language, she's at home in this place again. And so I thought that like that story is a nice mascot for the discussion that we're going to be having tonight. In fact, actually, the story, Zia, that you translated, if you can say a few words about it, but that's also a story about stories and a story about finding home in language, and in a way sort of about translation as well. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure, Lina. Thank you. First of all, thanks for having me. I'm very grateful to be part of such distinguished company of translators and writers today. So I came about this in a little bit of a roundabout way, not through the story, but through the writer. So Hamoud Saoud, this great, wonderful Omani writer, is a dear personal friend, and he's not well known, right? Not in the Arab world, and probably not even in Oman itself. But I read some of his books and I was just completely blown away by the depth of the writing, the the layers of metaphors, this kind of deep spirituality. And you meet him, the guy's a Sufi, it seemed like he speaks in these parables almost. Like I feel like he would make a great character in his own novels. I struggled really to kind of get across to my wife, who's very American, doesn't speak Arabic, just how powerful this prose was. And so it was mostly out of frustration in my inability to convey to my wife, how incredibly moving this text was. I said, you know what, I'm just going to sit down and translate this into English, and maybe I can capture, I don't know, 30% of what's there. And I started doing it, and it just kind of, it had a life of its own. So I'm kind of halfway into translating an entire book of his and hoping for more of it. But it's how can I explain this? So I'm Pakistani American, right? So there's a lot of, in Pakistan, in Urdu, there's a lot of kind of emotion behind reading and writing and poetry, and people sit around listening to each other kind of recite verse. And it's a little over the top and sometimes slightly melodramatic, but this kind of feeling that comes from text, as as Arabs do, as is common in the Arab.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
And so it was this. So I'm sitting there in my living room, reading something by Hamoud, and kind of like getting slightly teary-eyed maybe, or saying, bah, as people say in Urdu. And my wife's kind of giving me the side eye, saying like, hey, I don't get it. Like, how can you be so moved by something? And so that was it. I was trying to shore up.
I actually love that, because I think so many people come to translation out of that, that very personal impetus, right? Like this idea of like, this is such a beautiful thing. I want to try and be able to convey it with the same beauty to other people who don't understand it in its, in its original language. And I really like the way that, there's this kind of cadence in the piece that you captured really well. I mean, it is a conversational piece, right? But it's almost like it builds up in waves. Like it starts out very slowly, and it's like these waves that keep like cresting and breaking and cresting and breaking. And I really loved the way that rhythm sort of maintains. And I was curious, I wanted to go and like look at the original Arabic, but I actually didn't. I just preferred reading it in English, because I thought it was such an interesting experience to see it that way, and I could see in certain parts glimpses of the original Arabic, and or like the rhythms of the Arabic, but I could also see how it had completely changed, in terms of like the sentence structure. So I thought that was really interesting, and yeah, I agree that I do think that this is, this is a very specific motivation that you want to show up your wife, but I think that that's like also a pretty good encapsulation of why so many people, do come to translation. And so I want to turn to Chip actually and ask you, so you translated a short story by Zia Ahmed, whose novel you've worked on. So I assume that you have a kind of like close relationship with the writer. Do you consult with him? Do you speak with him? Do you, do you go back to him when you're working on his stuff? Or is it just become this relationship where like you are his voice in English now, and you don't even really need to kind of speak to each other? You have a kind of working relationship.
Well, we're even at the best of relationships with a writer and a translator, it's always helpful to have that direct communication with the author. So I do go back and forth with him, usually by email, just because it's just easier to sort of here's the line I'm having trouble with. What did you mean by this? So what do we? Yeah, I translated. I mean, when I did my PhD, it was on Muhammad Khodayar, the author from Basra, Iraq. So I was initially interested with his flash fiction collection that won a prize in 2018, the No Windmills in Basra, La Tawahin for Basra, because he's also from Basra, and all of his stories were set there, which was unusual. It was all flash fiction, that collection, which was generally the definition is something like under 1,500 words means it's flash fiction. So it was a different kind of fiction for me. It's obviously different from translating an entire novel or even short stories. So in this case, that book came out in English, and I went back to him. I'm planning to translate one of his other novels, but I sort of was jumping from the very short flash fiction to a full-length novel, which I've yet to tackle. I have some other things on my plate first. And I said, is there maybe something longer, like a short story? When I have to say, it's the connection to the writer, even before the story. And Dia said, this is the one from one of his recent collections. So it is great to sort of have that sort of collection. I have to say, my day job is working on translations of pre-modern medieval Arabic texts. And I have to say, Al-Jahiz doesn't answer his emails. You can't get long dead authors on Zoom. You can't get them on the phones. It's so much easier to say, what did you mean here? Or, what do you think I should do to solve this? So I always try to take advantage of that. And Dia Jubaili is a lovely person. And so but yes, I was delighted to sort of, when he sent me this story, and I think, Nada, you used the term eye-opening for these, whether you're reading it in the original or in translation. I think everything I've translated has always been eye-opening for me, in the sense that, there is something, even if you've read it in the original first, in translating it, you're wrestling with things you didn't notice originally. And the same way, certainly, I think every piece of fiction I translate, I learn something. I learn quite a lot. So particularly so with Dia's work.
I'd actually I found that story like really intriguing and a little bit disturbing as well. I'd be interested if you talk about, as you went into it, what were the small, because I feel like if something is a little bit disturbing in the reading of it, then in the translation of it, it gets under your skin that much more, because you're really kind of penetrating into so can you talk a little bit more about that story? Because I found it very disconcerting, actually.
Yes, I mean, when he sent it to me, I had not read the collection that it came from, so I was seeing it cold, and it's like, wow, it's surprising. It is set in Mosul after Daesh, as Daesh takes over the city in 2014, and all told through the eyes of a girl's doll that is left behind. The girl has grown up, the family leaves their home, and basically all the various dolls are rounded up and essentially put into a doll jail. They have sort of a storehouse where they keep all these dolls who come alive as soon as the door locks behind them at night. And so the dolls are all talking. There's a Barbie, there's a, Chucky, like all various dolls are sort of characters in this. And there's also a sex doll who is one of the characters in this warehouse.
It's like a horrifying Toy Story, actually.
It is. It's very. I mean, I've done some translation of like Ahmed Khalid Tawfiq, fiction, and sort of his taste for the macabre and sort of the supernatural. And this was, a little bit creepy. It's sort of translated during daylight hours because it was a lot. But yeah, it is. I mean, it really conveys kind of a sense of the kind of a sort of a doom. They're all sort of waiting their turn to be taken out, and then. You sort of discover what happens to the dolls after they're, people come in and select a doll, then they never see the doll again. So it is have sort of an eerie atmosphere. But again, with Dia Jubaili's work, I mean, it's very approachable in its way. It's very, I mean, I found it very compelling. But again, it is that sort of level of eeriness, which comes through in some of his shorter fiction too. That sort of spooky supernatural things move and talk that shouldn't, people turn into things in sort of the flash fiction he's done, and this seems more of something akin to that, but with a kind of a horror movie edge.
Especially because of the real life horror of ISIS that's sort of like behind it as well. I think that for me was really it wasn't just the fact that it's these macabre, like it's macabre what's happening, it's just the background being told through the story of these dolls, like this, that there's this incredible violence that's like lurking behind everything. And I just found that really, the translation does a really good job of capturing that sort of not just the eeriness, but the that there's a violence just beyond what we're able to see,
Yes, and that's I think that's a classic way that you convey it. You don't have to show the monster directly. You can sort of you see it from the limited point of view of this character who was essentially quite happy, and the girl who, it was kind of like a Toy Story. The girl grew up and moved away, but she still kept her doll in her childhood room, and so this doll, who's our protagonist, has a very limited understanding of what's happening, what the motives are, what people are doing, which I think is an effective way to sort of, often for things that are horrifying, or a way to convey, things that are brutal realities, can be even more effective in some sense. And I think it's a good use of sort of withholding as a fictional technique. So yeah, it was, yes, I thought anyways, I'm enamored of the story. Now I can't wait to turn to his longer novel, which is not as horrifying, but interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. And Rana, now, because I know how you work, you're working with a lot of different stories, and often you're translating at least one a month. Sometimes you're working on two, you're working on several things all together, and this one is actually a really fun one that you did. I found it quite, and I really like the kind of the lightness of the narrative voice that you captured. And I know that there's other things that you work on that have a much more formal register. I mean, obviously this is a thing in translation. We're working in many, many different registers, but the fact that you're constantly switching between so many different styles and so many different writers, is there like a particular approach that you take when you're working on a piece, given that you are working on so many different pieces at the same time? Or
Yeah, with the ones that I chose to translate for this issue, I go back to what Chip has said and what Zia and what Nada have said, where you have to have that connection with the piece. I mean, you come across a lot of pieces that you enjoy in the Arabic, but there are just those that just hold on to you more than the others. You think, actually, these are the ones I want to bring into another language. So with Muhammad al-Na'as, the mulberry tree that I translated, I'd known his work from his novel, the prize-winning novel, Bread on Uncle Milad's Table. I'd read it in Arabic, and I just fell in love with it. I fell in love with the style. The way it was narrated felt very contemporary, very new, especially coming out of Libya. Before the events of 2011, we rarely had any Libyan literature come out of Libya. We did have authors outside of Libya that produced work, that talked about that country, but from inside the country, he was one of those fresh voices that just, his words just fly off the page and strike you in a wonderful way. And sometimes they shock you as well, but as well, sometimes I think I am, especially with Muhammad al-Na'as, as I'm translating, although on the face of it, it's classic Arabic, and yet, as Chip was saying, you always learn something new, because there are nuances to the Libyan dialect that are different than, for example, where I come from, which is Jordan, and working with Lebanese or Arabic Jordanian. So there's a vast difference, and I think it's wonderful that I can have the rapport with Muhammad, although I don't know him personally, but having the emails and having that dialogue with him, he's always very receptive. He'll look at the piece after it's translated, he'll offer his advice, and through that process I learn a lot. So with this one in particular, I'm glad you said it was fun, because I thought so as well, and even through the fun you find out how things were. So it was a bit of a fairy tale slash as well, reminding the new generation, although he is young himself, reminding the new generation of how things were, and how things, although they start out with absurd skirmishes, can escalate and then change, the course of an entire history of the country. And so I thought this one was one of the lighter ones I worked with for this issue. The other one that I worked for this issue was the one by Haidar al-Ghazali, which came to me actually through our features editor, Malouh Lassa, and senior editor Malouh Lassa, and it's a piece from a Gazan writer, and this one, although there was a muted type of violence in it, it was still violent for two reasons. First of all, because of the topic that it dealt with, you know, a father having to witness the death of his son, and then he's had to leave him behind and go help others as the violence is going on. But it makes it more violent because of what's happening at the moment, you know, what we see in the news and what's happening live on our screens. So this one was although it was a shorter one, and it's more flash fiction than a longer piece of translation, but actually this one took more out of me than translating a longer piece, because I wanted to bring out the emotion and to show the horror without adding words from myself. I mean, I could have, you know, sometimes you want to add more, to express more, but you can't, because you're held back by the words of the author and what they want to convey, and in the way that they want to convey it. And so so it was two things. One was slightly lighter, one was heavy, but I enjoyed translating both of them. And this is how I go through, I think, to answer your question, this is how I go through all the pieces. I read them, and then I reread them, and then I lay them aside. But then if they keep talking back to me and coming back into my brain, that's when I go, no, it's a piece I want to tackle. And sometimes the difficult ones turn out to be the ones that I'm most proud of, although I am proud of all of them. But they're the ones that feel challenging. I learn more as I work with them, and they teach me, you know, how to do things and how to approach other texts later on. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. I find it, in fact, it's difficult to dislike any text that you're translating, you know, even if you read it and you're like, I don't really like this story. Once you start getting into it, there's something where you are going to, you know, like, you're not necessarily going to fall in love with it, but just as soon as you begin to see the particularities of it, it's like with any person, you know, you see the complexity. It's very difficult to just have a immediate, like, singular emotion towards someone that you know in all of these, you know, various ways. I do want to move on to talking about this idea of translating emotion and what it means at a moment like this. But before that, you brought up a point that I think is always a fun question and a very relevant question to talk to when in discussions of people who translate specifically from Arabic into English. You know, you were talking about the Libyan dialect, which is, how do you guys approach it when we are talking about dialogue, especially now that more and more writers are incorporating, you know, like their own dialect into the dialogue, or sometimes even into, you know, into the work itself, like into the text itself. So classical Arabic that's broken by dialect, right? And we know that there's like vast dialects across the Arabic world, and, you know, you're translating it now for an audience in English. How do you guys approach that? You know, what, of course, every text has like a different, I'm, you know, I'm not implying that there's like one generalized way to do it, but what are some instances, what are some sort of attitudes that you bring to the table? What are you trying to convey when you come to that? And, you know, how do you solve that problem? Because for me, this is such an interesting and ongoing question, you know? So is there anybody who wants to talk about that first, or Nada?
Well, thank you for saying Nada, because like I just translated Lost in Mecca, right, for by Buthain al-Isa, and honest to God, that was one of the first questions I had to ask myself. And even I didn't ask Buthain a lot about, you know, what do you mean by this, or what were you trying to accomplish here? And in fact, I don't think I emailed her except twice for two things that really she just invented. So I'm glad that, because she drove me crazy. I was researching something. She mentioned something related to religion, and you know, I went to the library and I'm like looking up all of these books, and I'm like, this doesn't exist anywhere. So I reached out to her for two things that eventually she told me, no, I just invented those things. Okay, good. But one of the things we discussed, one of the things we discussed early on was, who is this book for? Right? It's Lost in Mecca. It's a harrowing story. It's set in Hajj. It's told through multiple points of views, but it's a critique of the Arab world, right? So who is the target audience for this story? If I just say it's Westerners, people who, not just any Westerners, but Westerners who have no knowledge of what Mecca is to the Arab world, or what different versions of Arabs mean to each other. You were just mentioning dialect, but dialect is not just different sounds. In these locations, there are different sociopolitical orders. There are different,
Absolutely.
right, wars and legacies of wars, and economic inequality, and it's still ongoing, right? So one of the things we had to agree on in the beginning was, who are we writing it for? And that would determine how much domesticization or foreignization of the original text. And at the end of the day, I decided I'm going to write this story to Arabs in different parts of the world who cannot access it in the original language. So, you know, you mentioned dialect. There's a big part of it when they say things like Inshallah khair, right? Or Allahu Akbar, right? And for me, I was like, the way that I tried to approach this is, if I think that somebody who is like an Arab in a different part of the world understands those things, I'm not going to translate them. But specific hadiths and specific Quranic phrases, I'll try to get the melody in as much as possible, but then I'll also tag in an explanation so that it doesn't interrupt the text. People can still read it as though they were reading the original.
That's so you don't footnote it, you just sort of, you slip something into the text and you're adding it there. Yeah.
It was a pretty bold approach, because a lot of it includes, you know, religion and you know, hadiths or even tradition, and I'm not like a scholar of the culture and of tradition, but I approach this book as though this is a novel, and when people read it in the novel, they're not reading the Quran, they're just reading a novel. So how can I translate that experience of people reading this book in the original but in English?
That's really so interesting. I mean, like, the religious dimension is like yet another thing, because, you know, I mean, I'm sure all of the Arabic speakers know this, but the Quran is considered like the absolute pinnacle of the Arabic language, you know, and it's considered Arabic in its perfect form. So that's really like that's like an added dimension and an added challenge to try and convey that through the translation, and, you know, and to talk about that as, you know, that essentially it's perfection through language, which is such an interesting, you know, it's like, you know, it may sound blasphemous, but at the same, I find it just incredibly beautiful for anyone who loves language, just as a concept, you know, that the word is like the perfect word, you know, and it's just like, just as an idea and as a story, I find it kind of incredible. Yeah, sorry.
Can I just say one other thing?
Yes.
Like one of the biggest challenges in translating this book was, you're translating in a language that is de facto Islamophobic. So how do you, like, how do you, exactly what you just said, how do you render that the Arab world's approach to the Quran is reverence, even when they're critiquing it? The critique is not absolutely rejecting the text. It's not. It's critiquing the way that others have used the text in these ways that have created the inequalities, right? And I found that like the biggest challenge in translating a book like this is, how do you preserve the reverence of this holy text and the Arabic language while you're translating it in a language that is Islamophobic and Arabophobic? It drove me crazy.
That I mean, that is such a good and relevant question, and I think it applies to almost any translation that you are doing from Arabic. Any translation you're doing from Arabic, you are absolutely aware, especially at this point in time, of Islamophobia, Arabophobia. Even if, you know, it's about, I don't know, Christian Arabs or whatever it is, the language and the religion have become so enmeshed in the Western mind, and you're so aware of it. then it's cannot but inform your approach, to the way that you are translating this. Absolutely. I mean, I actually would love to hear from the rest of you about this. And Chip, not to like racially profile you, but as someone who, is originally American, correct?
Yes.
Yes, and like, and is not from an Islamic background, I assume. So how do you approach it? Do you feel that, because you're coming to it from the outside, but also as a speaker of the language and you're translating it into English, are you aware of these things? How do you approach them in your work? Is it something you think about? Is it something you remove from your mind while you're working and try not to think about it all? Or
Well, what's even trickier for translating, sort of Quranic quotations or things like those are maybe more straightforward to mark out. And in some ways, as a translator, you can't quite control how the book is going to be received out in the world, or how readers, English language readers, who are getting all other kinds of signals about Islam or about the Arabs or what this means, and you're kind of hoping that's readers are coming to this with sort of an open mind, or sort of a curious mind about the fiction you're writing. The other, what's also challenging particularly is authors will use Quranic metaphors or language or references that would be automatic to an Arabic speaker and have great meaning that will sort of resonate. I mean, the way in English, if someone drops a line that is some reference to Shakespeare, if you're an English language reader, educated, you will know what the author is referring to. How do you convey that when you're translating an author who maybe uses some Quranic or a reference to something that occurs in sort of in the Quran, or sort of religious term, which is instantly evokes associations for its readers in Arabic, but you're doing it for readers in English who presumably do not have that. Some may. That's a tricky one, and I think, as Nada said, it's there are subtle ways to do that, and then there's sort of the clunky ways, and getting and sort of footnotes, of course, are kind of the buzzkill of reading fiction. Noel Coward had a great quote that a footnote while reading a novel, it's like being interrupted while lovemaking to go down and answer the doorbell every time you hit a footnote in the middle of your reading a book, a novel. So it's but there are subtle ways to do that, to convey to readers you're telling them information while they may not realize. That's sort of a clause you've added. I'm such a huge fan of glossaries at the back of a book, which is just the most subtle. If you don't need the glossary, if you know what the book is referring to, you don't need to look at the back, but if you do, go right ahead. And just to get back to your issue of dialect too, this is really something that's so easy to stumble on as translators. It's very hard to do, to sort of, again, pick and choose how much do you register a change in how much do you indicate a change in register in your translation, where there's now we're in Fossa MSA, switch to 2 characters speaking in dialect or colloquial, and English doesn't quite have the same switch with that. That's very harder to render that in English. So, I mean, it's a little goes a long way, I found, just to indicate maybe a character might be speaking more casually. And it's just, I've seen attempts to sort of find some sort of equivalent in English, which never seems to work. Well, why are these two people in Cairo talking in Cockney accents or something? There's something like that where you're trying to sort of really convey. So it's sort of a light touch, I think, is found, sort of goes quite a bit with that. And then otherwise it's the kind of thing that sometimes is just, there are things you just can't capture in translation. It's sort of, you wish you could capture 100% of what you think the author is saying in the original, but you might have to settle for 72% or 50% or whatever you think is worth or sort of is has the most significance or meaning for the reader, or will convey the most that you can. So it's sort of like the best it's sort of, you're not going to get everything, but you at least convey something, and just make sure that what you're conveying is the thing that really is what you find is sort of the gist of what is important in that section of dialogue or in that section of text. I just for one novel, just to end on this, one of the first novels I did translated there's a reference to Midian the city associated with Moses and the Quran, not really known to maybe English speakers. Midian doesn't really occur in the Bible. So, it was a reference to a city that just had very little, significance, I would assume, for my readers in English. So I had to find a workaround around that to explain what this was, why this character was referring to this, or why his escape was similar to Midian and Moses escaping the Pharaoh from that Quranic account. So it's I mean, as I said, there's clever ways to do it and there's clunky ways. And one of the things I have to say is, if you're going to keep something in the original language in Arabic, a phrase like Allahu Akbar, or whatever, or a word, a particular kind of food, or molokhia, whatever you're referring to, my rule of thumb is I'd never italicize that, just because italics just calls attention to the foreignness, and you want to make it seem not foreign, but just as part of the language. And you just assume your readers have to catch up. We're going to refer to something that you're not familiar with, but treat it like it's any other English word, because you are reading a Lebanese novel, an Egyptian novel, an Emirati novel.
That's an interesting point, actually. Maybe I want to come back to that, because there are so many different schools of thought on that as well. It's like because you can also argue that you do want your reader to feel that they are outside of something, and sort of like that they are not implicated in this, that they are an audience, that they're a witness, as opposed to trying to make it as fluid. But I wanted to actually, because Zia, I also saw you nodding when we were talking about this idea of like translating from Arabic for a Western audience, and and inherently we can argue an inherently Islamophobic audience, and whether we like it or not, this language is connected with that. So can you talk a little bit in your experience, whether it's about translating dialect or whether it's about translating particular things that have cultural or religious relevance, and then how you approach that, bringing it into English, and what your feelings are, whether you bring them to the foreground or not, about how this might be received in English?
So first of all, I agree completely with everything Chip and Nada said about dialects, about how do you capture sort of the essence of a text. But for me, there's also a very personal challenge, which is one of representation. So I'm not Arab. I didn't grow up with the language. I came to it, later in life. And one of the pieces I did for Markaz it's by Huda Hamid, who's a pretty phenomenal Omani writer. And she's writing, in first-person voice about a certain Omani woman. And so first of all, there was the problem of dialect, right? So this woman described herself as, I think that's the title of the story now, Besara, which isn't a word. Like, I've never heard it before. You can't look it up in a dictionary. And just going by hints in the text itself, I kind of tried to intuit the meaning, and apparently ended up really far away from what it really meant. You can read the story to figure out what I'm talking about. And frankly, I had to rely on Huda herself. So WhatsApp is a translator's best friend if you're connected to the author. And so through a series of conversations, I finally kind of got it, and it wasn't at all what I thought it was. But then it started this other sense of kind of imposter syndrome, call it what you will, this sense of embarrassment. How am I, a non-Arab speaker of Arabic who learned to speak as an adult and doesn't perhaps have the cultural understanding of not just Arab culture at large, but also of Omani culture in particular, is somehow now speaking in English in the voice of a particular subclass of Omani from a generation ago. And that just brings a lot of baggage, right? But then how I kind of justify it to myself is, unlike all of the nuance that, Chip and Nada bring to their work, I feel like I'm writing for a Western audience, frankly. And so if a footnote is needed, Noel Coward, all respect to him, then there's going to be a footnote. But anything to make the text understandable to Joe, who just goes into, I don't know, Barnes and Noble and picks out a book and can understand it, and perhaps rely on a glossary or a footnote if need be. And perhaps that doesn't quite capture, the essence.
That's very interesting. So
Oh, sorry, go on.
No, no, not at all. Sorry. I think there's a little bit of a lag. I'm thinking out loud. It just sounds to me like you and Chip are maybe a little bit more thinking about like a more like a Western audience, like the Joe Blow who is, let's say a like purely American or purely European or whatever it is, whereas Nada's talking about a particular like diasporic Arab who has lost contact with the language. And I just find that really interesting because I think it just kind of made me think about the fact, I think I'm always talking to the way that, Zia and Chip, you guys are talking about, like somebody who really is completely alien to this. Whereas when I'm writing, it's not. I'm talking more to diaspora Arabs. But I just find that really interesting because I hadn't thought about it necessarily in that way of how much familiarity somebody has with the original culture, also in terms of affection or understanding or, and nuance. But I find the reason I wanted to bring back this idea of like the Quran and Islamophobia is that, you're talking, but you're speaking also as a Pakistani, as an Urdu speaker, you were saying is one of your mother tongues, I suppose. And that it's also a language, I think, because of its proximity to Arabic, and because of where it is in situated in that part of the world as well. It is, to me, it's slightly different than, and correct me if I'm wrong, please, but I feel like, yes, in Arabic, you don't have the exact same experience, but it does feel like you would understand that experience of being inherently approached as like suspicious, let's say, not to use like a more a stronger word, but this idea of like being inherently seen with suspicion, and just the language itself, the shape of the letters themselves, things that are beautiful and innocent and reverent and all of these things, as Nada was saying, all of a sudden they take on these sinister tones. So I wonder again how, I wanted to see if that plays into in any way, your approach to translation, or if it's something that you keep in mind as you're working, or
I think that's a really good question, Lina, and I had thought about it, but I think unlike Nada, my response is perhaps more cowardly, which is I don't approach the texts which require such kind of thoughtfulness. Am I speaking as an Arab? Am I speaking as a Muslim? What does, the random Western person in a bookshop think of this text? Am I casting Islam or the Arab world in a bad light? So I think I very deliberately pick out things that are, I don't know, the word is not exactly secular, but spiritual, perhaps, or modern texts like the novel by Huda Hamid I was talking about. But any kind of deeper insight into Islam or violence, or I'm not sure what, pick your favorite Orientalist cliche. I think I choose the coward's way out by not taking it on.
I mean, I don't know if I would use the word cowardice, to tell you the truth. I think that all of these questions have become much more relevant in recent times, because I remember there was a long time ago where, that I met this writer, an Arab writer who writes in English. And, I was quite young at the time, and I was really interested in this question of like, I asked her, how do you approach writing in English, you come from the Arab world? And she kind of looked at me and she said, well, I just write what I feel. Like, this is the language that I feel in. And, and I remember being quite dissatisfied with that answer. And I think what it was is that we were just of completely different generations. Because for me, I was really at a point, and I still grappling with this idea of, again, I speak very good English. I blend in very well, but like, I was very much struggling with this idea of the language itself being viewed with suspicion, and the culture being viewed with suspicion, and sort of like, how does one translate oneself? How does one translate one's culture? And that's really what brought me to translation. Is I always felt that my writing itself was already an act of translation. So I suppose I wouldn't call it cowardice. All of this is just to say that I think that we've all and this is just, you know, the way that I see it, is we've all been forced into these confrontational positions, I think, because of the way that the world is, and because of our positions as, let's say, mediators between different languages. You have to be aware, or you are aware of, not just, you know, meaning, but perception of meaning and perception of the language itself. And, you know, we are also translators because we love writing and language and literature, and there's something about that that is alone is like a kind of a higher calling. But unfortunately, everything is politicized. And in fact, I think, Rana, if you could go back and talk about the story, because I've seen you nodding throughout, and we've had these conversations as well a little bit. But I would really like you to maybe, you can talk about it in terms of the story from Gaza that you just translated, or you can just talk about it as a translator in this particular moment, you know.
Yeah, you know, there are several things. You know, when Zia was talking about representation, you know, I could reverse it. I could reverse it and say, you know, I am a person who represents the Arab language, and who am I to translate into another language? But you know, end of the day, no matter how you look at it, you're always coming to any language in the name of love. And this might sound cliche, but it's the love of the language that draws you. You know, you're a kind of bridge, actually. You're not coming to it as a form of resistance. There might be some level of resistance to an Arab-phobic language, but you're dealing with language that you love on both sides. And I think you do have to have an appreciation and a love for both languages for you to be able to blend them and bring that bridge together. So I think in a way, you know, you feel responsible for these pieces. Once you have these pieces in your hand, what I'm trying to say is you feel responsible for them. And like you were saying, you know, there are some texts that when you come to, or they come to your table and you go, oh my God, I'm not sure how I'm going to translate this, or whether I should be translating it. But once you live with it and it lives with you, there becomes this sort of engagement with it, and it grows on you, and the text becomes part of you. And so then you have a responsibility to bring it out in the best form that you can. And that's where, you know, you research in both languages. You think, and like Chip was saying, some things, you know, no matter how hard you try, they just won't translate. They won't come out. But you know, I'm with him on no italics, and just putting the languages, and that's where the bridge comes. You know, you put those two languages together, and you're creating a third language, really. So in a way, you're also a creator of a new language. You're no longer working with English or Arabic. You're actually creating a third language, which now you're presenting, and you're hoping it'll work. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, but you hope it does. And so, you know, like when we were talking about the Gaza issue by Haidar al-Ghazali, you know, Haidar al-Ghazali, it's a Gaza story that is of the moment. You know, things are happening right now, and as much as you want to put emotion or extra footnotes, or try to you have to stay faithful to the text. You can't replace the writer. It's the writer himself or herself. If this is what they want to say, then you try to bring the best of it into the third language that you're working with. And so yeah, I just think that there is a personal a personal investment when you take a text. There's a personal investment that you put from your side, but there's also a responsibility that somebody's put their work into your hands, and it's your responsibility to bring it out in the best form that it can appear to others. But as well, there's also the idea, we talked about the idea of, you know, the added pressure on myself as an Arab writer, or as an Arab from the region as well, to bring out the musicality, to bring out the beauty of the language itself. You know, there's a one dimension to the region and the language and the people, where it's always about grief and horrors and wars and things being done to us. Whereas I think sometimes there is lurking at the back of my mind when I personally take a text, is that I want to show the beauty, and there's happiness and there's joy and there's births and there's skirmishes and all sorts of
or playfulness, actually, like in the Mulberry story, that it's very, you know, even though it's about something that like becomes, you know, quite serious, there's something very playful about it and very, you know, in that kind of narrative voice.
Yeah, and that just adds dimensions, you know, more dimensions to not only characters, but to the region itself. It presents you with something more than what you read in headlines and news.
So do you feel that this desire kind of will affect the kind of stories that you will choose to translate sometimes?
I want to say no. I want to say no. But honestly, I'm sure a part of me goes, yeah, well, I'll take this one over this one. I mean, we're only human. So I want to say no, that I'll take every text as it is. And sometimes, you know, I love it because you're surprised. You're always, there's always this element of surprise where, you know, you read the first few lines and you think, I'm not sure. But then something happens. This magic has to happen for you to connect with the text. And there you go. There you have it. Then you're stuck with the text and it won't let go of you anyway, even if you tried. So
yeah, no, I agree. There's something of alchemy to it. And it's funny because you said, you know, we're only human, which brings us actually, because if we're going to start going to the Q&A portion, I mean, we just have 2 questions here, but I think one of them is kind of a huge discussion that you can have an entire seminar on, which is, you know, the question of like, how do we feel about like AI and machine translation? And, you know, it's interesting, Chip, you were saying, and I completely agree with you, and I think we're all nodding, is like, you know, you can never capture 100% of the text. Sometimes you do 72%, sometimes 82%, sometimes, you know, and to me, that is the part where the human resides. You know, it's you are going to maybe get a different 82% than somebody else, 85% or whatever it is. You know, it's like the thing that you think is the most important thing to bring out of the text, or the most kind of exciting part of the dialogue, or whatever it is. That's, you know, that's based on your judgment. But I'm curious to see what you guys think about AI translation, and whether, you know, it's something that you think about. Do you use AI tools? Do you swear them off completely? And how do you, like, what is your perspective on how it might affect all our work as translators, you know, in the future?
I'll pop in. Others may. I mean, I've never used AI at all. Like at all. I really should be much more proactive about just checking it out myself. I mean, that's the one thing, of course, that AI probably can't do, is to make that kind of judgment of like, well, if I'm translating this text, what is the 82% or 72% that I think is the most vital part, that has the most significance, or that will really convey what the author was intending without sacrificing too much. I mean, maybe in 5 years this will be a very different conversation, and they'll be up to 99%, and you know, and you know, we'll but that's one thing. I think, you know, it's coming. There's I'm not going to pretend I can predict what's coming down the line. So far, of course, you know, there are tools online that you can, you know, if you're having particular issues with, well, how is this word you know, sort of, you look at, you know, been used in other contexts for, you know, and how it might have been translated. Those you can kind of Google and, you know, take a look at how other you know, people have approached this. But other than that, it's almost more like you're just on the Titanic and just saying, I'm not going to pay attention to that iceberg that's looming ahead. We'll just ignore it and hope it goes away. And I'm
just going to fiddle. Yeah,
I'm just going to fiddle and just keep rearranging the deck chairs. I mean, that's a terrible metaphor, but yeah, that's all I have to say about AI. I'm curious what other people think about it, or if they use it and found it helpful.
You know, I just want to chip in very quickly and say, you know, with you know, the sad thing would be if we used AI is the loss of the voices. You know, when I read Nada's story, Chip's story, Zia's story, even though they were in translation, there was a difference between all of them. The emotions were different, the melodies were different, the beats were different. They stood out. Whereas I worry that with AI they'll all sound the same. So it's just a matter of translating from one language to another, and that's it. You lose all the beauty and you lose all the music in between. And therefore it just ends up as, you know, understanding the text. But what does understanding the text mean if it doesn't come with everything else that's associated with it? If it doesn't move your heart, it doesn't move your, you know, your sense of smell or your other sense. It doesn't do anything for you. So you might as well be opening a dictionary and checking out word for word what everything means. And so I think the beauty of everyone's pieces here, and I can't reiterate enough how much I enjoyed all your pieces, you know, in the Markaz review, and I'm so grateful to be among all of you as well. So that is something that I would really be very sad in losing if AI were to become the norm.
I mean, you're essentially trying to put your finger on like where is the soul of a story? Like, where does it reside? Like, what is the living part of a story? Which is, I think, the privileged position of the translator is you come closest to being able to try and identify that. You know, like the reader is the person who experiences, let's say, the result of that living part of the story. But I think the translator is sort of the one who's going into the soul of the thing, you know, going into the body and kind of, you know, my metaphor is muddled, but I think you know what I mean. It's the, you know, it's the person who's most close to approaching like that mystery that is never going to be able to be solved, but you know, you come close to it. But I mean, I think it's just even the fact that we say that there is an insistence on something living, on the fact that there is a soul, is already a position that we're taking about language and literature, I guess. But yeah, yes, Neda.
So I honestly was never interested in translation up until recently when I went to Columbia. And I went to Columbia originally to study poetry, but Susan Bernofsky said to anybody who has another language, come to the orientation for LTAC, which is literary translation at Columbia. She said in the translation, she literally pitched translation for us as a creative act, and a creative act that was going to make you better writers. And honestly, as someone born and raised in Kuwait, I've never heard translation being spoken of in this personal, subjective manner. The way the AI conversation is pitched reminds me of the way that I grew up with translation, which is translation as a mechanical act. You capture what is right, what is wrong. There's a proper way to convey meaning, and then you get Fs if you don't do it the way that the professor wants you to, right? But for me, what attracted me to translation is, hang on, it's a creative process. It is as personal and as subjective as it is when I write poetry or, you know, prose. And I'll give you an example. With Lost in Mecca, I decided, and this is where I don't know if AI can come in to this or not, but like, I decided I wanted to retain the melody of the Arabic language in my English translation. So there's a line in the book where Buthaina writes, Sumaya badat kashabahin shahibin. And the translation for this is pale ghost, but pale ghost misses the tanween, right? The shabahin shahibin and the shabaha, right? In both words, there's an alif in one and there's a tanween in the other. So this is something where I was like, I'm not just translating meaning, I am translating the impact that sound does on an Arabic reader. So for me, it of course it broke my head, but when I got the equivalent in English, I was really happy. I'm still proud. I'm still saying it in this.
What was it?
So Sumaya badat kashabahin shahibin, right? And I went with almost ghostly, right?
Oh, that's lovely.
most with
Yeah.
ghost, but then there's also that added difference in Tanween, all and Li. And I'm very proud of it. But yeah, can AI do
You
this?
should be. You should be. You should be. No, that's really beautiful. I mean, to me, these are the most interesting questions of translation, you know, just like the most interesting stuff. But yeah, you should be very proud of that. Sorry, Zia, yeah.
I was just going to say the obvious, which is where is the soul of the text? You know, that's a spiritual question, of course, and that's why I'm hoping all of us can keep our jobs for a little while longer. But you know, AI or auto translation as just something to speed up the, let's be honest, the somewhat laborious task of going from one language to the other. A good friend of mine is a translator by profession, and he relies heavily on it, not for the soul of the text, but just to get, you know, to get a baseline into which he then
Right.
injects or re-injects the soul. And I think that's how it was. And to deny that that's not going to be the future, I think there'll always be space for being almost ghostly, right? Which is why people like Nada are so precious. But to speed up all of our tasks, I think to ignore these tools, it just makes us slower.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree. It's funny. I have a great suspicion of it, and I find it, but I recently, just out of curiosity, I plugged in two different texts, and one of them was a literary text, and one of them was a much more technical text, and it did a great job with the technical text. And in fact, I was shocked at what a great job it did, from Arabic into English. But it did a horrible job with the literary text, like absolutely horrible job. And it was like way worse than Google Translate, in fact, would have done with the literary text, which I thought was really interesting. One experiment. I'm not like going to draw any giant conclusions from that, but it brings me actually to one of the other questions that we have, which Hassan Abdelrazak is asking, if we could speak more about that challenge of translating dialogue. And to me, I really find this like an endlessly fascinating, it's an endlessly fascinating question because again, and I think there's as many answers as there are translators, but specifically with that AI translation, this was a very dialogue heavy piece and the dialogue was atrocious. Like it had no idea what to do with the dialogue, what to do with the register of the dialogue. This could also partly be because it's probably trained on Fusha Arabic and the dialogue was like in, much more dialect. But it was funny to see that it like broke the machine's brain. Like it didn't understand the way that people talked. It was just completely garbled nonsense. So like so one thing that I wanted to bring up, actually, there's a book by a Mexican writer called Hurricane Season. I don't know if any of you have read it. The writer is Fernanda Melchor. Anyway, so it was translated from the Spanish by Sophie Hughes, who I think is just an incredible translator. I don't understand Spanish, but reading it in English, already I felt like there was something that I could learn from it and then when I read about the book, it's a book that is written in a very, very specific dialect that partly the author made up, partly it's taken from like different Mexican dialects of Spanish. But the way that she approached that, I found so interesting. I was reading it and I was like a little bit taken aback. So she uses, I think, Chip, you were giving the example of you can't just use Cockney all of a sudden, like why are these two? Very true, right? Or like same would go for like, they're speaking in a Texan dialect or they're speaking in, any kind of like whatever we consider as English speakers dialect that is like, let's say rural or upper class or this or this or that. So what she did, her solution to this was she took a number of different dialects in English and kind of merged them together. So what the impression that you get is that you're reading something that is extremely colloquial and it is like, and it's a playful language that where people are using things that, whether it's like, it's just very clear that it's a lived in language, with that implies a great deal of camaraderie between people, that they have this kind of internal code that they speak to one another in. And I thought it was such an interesting approach, like taking from all of these different dialects of English in order to give the English speaker the same impression of not of like Mexican Spanish, but of a Spanish that is heavy with code, with internal meaning, with So I thought that was such an interesting approach, because I do think that in the end that's the 82%, or that's the the 89% where the soul resides, which is how do people talk to one another, and what is the subtext in these conversations, especially when and I do find this like such an interesting question in Arabic, because again, as Nada was saying, it brings back, it's also relationships between not just different classes, but like different all of the ways that you put it, different histories of war, different countries, different ways of conceiving of the self, even different histories. So yeah.
I love what you just mentioned, because you're detailing all of the different ways content makes an important or added value to the text, right? But as writers, as people who already write poetry and prose, we understand that dialogue is important to us also at the level of form, not just content. So it's not just about what is being said. It's dialogue is used as a pacing mechanism. It's tension. It's how to create suspense. It's how to create climax. 100%, right? And
yeah,
I'm not against AI, and I'm somebody who isn't very, let's say, my knowledge of the Arabic language is not as strong as my knowledge of the English language. So I call myself a literary translator, so no immediate translations for me. I rely heavily on tools. Like I look at multiple dictionaries, I look at etymologies. Some of the websites that I've frequented billions of times in translating the book was El Maani and like Reverso Context. So I'm pretty sure that AI is going to make those tools helpful for us, so we can still retain our creativity as we for example, instead of spending 7 hours looking at 20 different dictionaries, that process can be shrunk. The amount of knowledge that a website will have is going to multiply. Like, I'm really looking forward to that. But as I said, if we're thinking of translation as a mechanical act, like Lina was saying, nonfiction mostly is thinking in terms of meaning, right? How can I get clear, concise meaning the reader can understand, and make it as close to the original as possible? I think AI, the version of AI where you just dump an original text 500 pages, that might be really helpful for those kinds of professional translators. But if we're translating literary fiction, then I think the idea that translation is a creative act is still going to be paramount. And we're still going to be thinking way much more than just semantics, right?
Can I just add to this one thing as well? I think and I agree with you, Nada, completely about it being a creative process, but also what AI fails to do is that it doesn't respect the reader, holding the end product in their hand, especially if we go back to the idea of class and dialogue. So it might translate it into a legible English that people can understand. But then when your reader, whether it's in the Arab world, let's say you're writing for an Arab audience who can speak the English language, and they read that text, they go, somebody from that class would never use that word. And if they say that to more than 3 lines of your text, you've lost your reader. So I think as well, there's a respect for your reader to provide them with the proper nuance of the words and the meaning, and like Nada said, including the form and the creative process itself, so that you have a complete creative process to offer, or a creative product to offer. Sorry, Chip, please go ahead. You had your hand up as well.
Oh, yeah, I was just, it did occur to me, Nada, of course, the act of translation is a creative act, which again, it's not mechanical as the sort of I think translators have been drumming into the heads of publishers and their readers for years. So in that sense, it seems to me, AI is essentially something that is backward looking, in the sense that it can look back at what has been written before, and then like, I'm going to apply that to this text in front of me. Whereas something creative is inherently forward looking. You are bringing something new into the world. And that's the one thing AI does not. There's an intention behind writing a novel. There's an intention behind translation. And that intention will be reflected in how you translate how the characters are speaking. What is the point of this sentence? What are they trying to convey? What is the musicality here that I want to render in my translation? And at best, AI, you could just say, I'd like you to take all of Rana Asfour's previous translations, feed it into AI, and now it'll sound like her when it's translated, or whoever the translator is. But at best, that's just sort of, muddy, the brute force approach that just sort of muddies everything, just kind of becomes, or even worse, just take every novel that's been translated by this particular novelist and feed that into AI, and then you get, a new novel by this person in English. So it just, it is that sort of brute force approach that really just sort of plows right over all the reasons why we read fiction in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. I think actually that's a really lovely note to end on. The triumph of individual creativity over, yeah. And I mean, the only thing I will add to that is, like, I always think of, translation as also like an interpretive act, and fundamentally it's like it's an interpretive act, and that requires, any interpretive act. Writing is also an interpretive act. It's filtered through a particularity, and that's not something that a machine has. And it just, until they achieve sentience, really. And the differences may be subtle, but the differences are there, and yeah, it does come down to this idea about meaning versus, so I find that, for me, I'm still quite optimistic. And I think most translators that I speak to, because they know how much work goes into what they do, and they know the kind of careful choices that they make, are a lot more optimistic about the future of literary translation, let's say, than non-translators who are like, this is going to change everything and soon we won't need people anymore. So far, I mean, maybe I'm not talking to enough of them, but so far the translators that I know are not super concerned with this, because, I think they're more concerned that people, publishers or the people who are pay the paychecks, sign the paychecks, are going to think what you do is not that important. But I think translators themselves are like, this is still really far away from, maybe I'm being extra optimistic, but I think that I find that quite like an interesting observation, Anyway, and does anyone have any final thoughts, anything that they would like to add? No. I would really like to thank all of you. I mean, this could go on and on, frankly. I just find this such an interesting discussion. It's a discussion that is kind of never ending, and there's so many different dimensions to it, whether it's, from like the beautiful little, nerdy choices that like Neda just took us through about, to kind of a larger spiritual questions that Zia was talking about, or, and I just find it like such a fascinating topic of discussion. And I think that, in the end, we ended up talking about translation as a general thing as well. But I do think that there's maybe at a later date, we can even talk further, because it's such a broad topic, but like also specifically about the subject of Arabic to English translation. To me, this is just like endlessly, fascinating. I don't think it's just endlessly fascinating for me. I think that, living in this multipolar world, translation is like just maybe the most fundamental act of like trying to understand one another. And I would just like to thank all of you for this discussion and for all your valuable contributions, for the work that you've put into this issue of the Markaz review, for just the work that you do in general. It's very necessary work. I believe in it fundamentally. And like, you know, in the middle of an ugly world, there's very little that makes me feel optimistic as much as, you know, writing and language and this very careful and calibrated way of people patiently trying to communicate with one another with, as Rana said, love, you know, whether it's writing or translation. It's kind of cheesy to say, but these are all acts of love in the end, you know, and they're acts of love and patience and dignity and kindness. And yeah, that's the note that I would like to end on, frankly. So thank you all very, very much. Thank you to all the participants, to everybody who tuned in. I know it was a bit of a long discussion, but I hope, you know, I hope that it was enlightening. And yes, please sign up for our newsletter if you want to, you know, listen to more interesting discussions like this. If you want to read more of everybody's work, our next roundtable discussion is going to be writing across boundaries, queerness, multilingualism, and generational clashes in fiction. And that is moderated by our senior features editor, Malu Halasa. And that is on August 14th, as you can see, I think, on your screen now. So that promises to be super interesting. So please tune into that. Please sign up for the newsletter, read the Markaz review, and take care of one another. All right. And of course, if you would, yeah, I was just going to say also, of course, if you would like to donate to support this effort, also, we would be very grateful, because, you know, this is a community-run website and magazine. And anyway, all right. Thank you so much,
Lina.
everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.